Ukraine's offensive into Russia's Kursk region has generated a lot of footage of battles, of tanks, of explosions, but also of prisoners being taken. Lots of Russians, also some Ukrainians, falling into their enemy's hand. Often their faces are bound by tape, their hands also bound. In some places they've been taken in quite large numbers. Ukraine's SBU said its commandos had captured no less than 102 Russian conscripts and members of Chechen special forces on Wednesday alone in one incident. Footage of that shows dozens of men lined up, lying down on the side of the road. Prisoner taking has been a key part of this war since the beginning, and that's because if your enemy takes your soldiers prisoner, you need some of theirs in order to exchange them. There's actually been at least 54 exchanges of prisoners of war between Russia and Ukraine since the full-scale invasion in 2022. They usually actually take place on a checkpoint between the Sumy and Kursk oblasts. I'm not sure if that is still open following the recent events in Kursk. It's so important that President Zelensky often talks about replenishing the exchange fund when Ukrainian troops capture Russians. And the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk has generated an unusual number of prisoners just because the Ukrainians have moved so quickly. Instead of these slow attritional battles for trenches over a few hundred yards that we've been seeing over the past 6 months in Donbass, where quite often people are able to retreat before the enemy approach their trenches. In this case, Ukrainian forces fanned out into Kursk Oblast very, very quickly, overpowering poorly armed, poorly trained, in many cases simply unprepared Russian units. So that's why so many Russian prisoners seem to have fallen into Ukrainian hands on this occasion. We don't know exactly how many Russians have been captured, but we've heard talk of upwards of 1,000. In fact, the Ukrainians are making so much of the number of prisoners they've taken that it's beginning to look like taking prisoners was one of the objectives of this operation. Kyrylo Budanov, Ukraine's head of military intelligence, has said that a committee is going to be set up, in fact it has already been established, to coordinate the question of prisoner exchanges, getting guys back from Russia. That's significant because previously exchanges had been organised on a fairly ad hoc basis, often with Ukraine's human rights ombudsman speaking by telephone with his Russian counterpart. And the numbers exchanged in those swaps could be anything from 50 to 95, a few dozen. The ultimate goal, Ukraine's human rights ombudsman has said, is an all-for-all swap. He's also said that he doesn't expect that to happen anytime soon. So what is the plan? Well, Kyrylo Budanov, Ukraine's head of military intelligence, has said Ukraine will be seeking the release of prisoners in the following order of priority. First, the seriously wounded and gravely sick. Secondly, all female prisoners. Thirdly, those who have been in captivity the longest. The longer ago you were captured, the sooner you should be released. Thirdly, those troops who were captured during the defense of Mariupol and the Azovstal steelworks in the siege there in 2022, and then civilians. He went on to mention Crimean Tatars. Now that's actually quite interesting, because if you were looking at Ukrainian military Telegram channels, you might get the impression that this entire operation was about one group of prisoners, the guys who defended Azovstal. Since the Kursk operation began, several videos have been released filmed by Ukrainian soldiers coercing Russian prisoners of war to say on camera that they want to be exchanged for Azov regiment fighters who were captured at Mariupol. It's happened multiple times.
Сумин 9-го полка 3-го батальона попал в плен к военнослужащим, к украинским военнослужащим. Хочу попасть на обмен, так же как бойцы Азова и Мариуполя.
These are all quite clearly shell-shocked guys. We should make clear that they are pretty obviously speaking under duress. They've obviously been told to say this. The question is, why? Is this an initiative from soldiers at the front who want to bring the Azov guys home, or is it being directed from somewhere higher up the chain? And the reason I raise that question is because the question of Azov-style prisoners is a political hot potato in Ukraine. Ever since they were captured, there have been almost weekly demonstrations in the center of Kiev with people demanding that the Azov prisoners are brought home. You're not meant to have protests in Ukraine under martial law. No one really dares interfere with it. if President Zelensky can bring back those guys, it will be a big domestic political win for him. A bit of context, of course, the regiment that led the defense of the Azovstal steelworks and Mariupol was the Azov regiment, which is hugely controversial because of its far-right roots, and Russia has consistently refused to release most of those soldiers. Russia has always portrayed them as the quintessential essence of the Nazis they claim to be fighting in Ukraine, and for that reason has consistently refused to include a lot of those guys in exchanges. And when I've spoken to other Ukrainian soldiers who were captured in Mariupol, who were held in prisoners alongside Azov regiment prisoners, they talked about how those guys were singled out for incredibly brutal treatment. One man's told me about listening to one of them being beaten to death in the cell next to them. So their plight is particularly desperate. So not only is their plight particularly desperate, but there's an amount of symbolism for both sides. So that's why securing their release would be such a big win for Ukraine and such a blow from a propaganda point of view for Russia. These talks are incredibly delicate and can take a very long time. Both Russia and Ukraine keep the number of prisoners they hold and the number of their own men that they think the opponent holds secret. But it's generally thought that the Russians hold more prisoners and therefore they have the upper hand in negotiations. How this is going to play out, well, we don't know. It's going to be a very long, delicate process and it's not going to be carried out in public. But a thing to remember when talking about prisoners of war is that these are people. Being captured is a terrifying thing. We know that prisoners of war have been abused, tortured, occasionally killed. There are going to be families praying with their fingers crossed that finally, maybe, their loved ones are going to be coming home.
Ukraine!